There is a question that some people carry for years without ever putting it into words, not because they don't feel it, but because naming it out loud would make it too real. The question is something like this: why is it so hard for me to receive love without waiting for it to disappear? Maybe you've never asked it exactly that way. Maybe it showed up differently, as a low hum of anxiety when someone got too close, or as a sudden urge to pull back the moment a relationship started to feel safe. Maybe it was the voice that whispered this won't last every time something good arrived. If you recognize something in that, even faintly, stay with me. Because what we're going to explore today isn't a diagnosis, it's a map. And maps are only useful if you are willing to look at where you actually are, not where you wish you were. This video is about what happens inside a child who grows up without emotional warmth, not cruelty necessarily, not violence, sometimes just silence. Distance, a parent who was physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely, and about the 5 patterns that tend to follow that child into adulthood, long after the house they grew up in is just a memory. Before we go further, if something in what I just said already landed somewhere in you, I'd invite you to like this video and subscribe if you haven't yet. This channel exists for exactly the kind of person who pauses at a question like that instead of scrolling past it, and I want to ask you something you don't have to answer out loud, but I want you to sit with it. Growing up, when you were hurting, what did you do with that feeling? Did you show it, or did you learn to put it somewhere? If you feel comfortable, share one word in the comments. Just one. Now, let's begin. The first thing to understand is that a child does not have the psychological apparatus to look at a cold or distant parent and conclude there is something incomplete about this person's capacity for warmth. That level of assessment requires perspective, distance, a degree of individuation that children simply haven't yet achieved. What the child does instead is far more natural and far more damaging in the long run. He turns the lens inward. When a child reaches toward a parent and the parent does not reach back, not once but again and again, across months and years, the child's psyche begins to construct an explanation. And the explanation it builds is this: there is something about me that does not deserve warmth. This inversion from the parent is cold to I am the reason for the cold is one of the central mechanisms Jung identified in the formation of what he called the complex. Not complicated, as people sometimes assume. The word means something more precise, a constellation of emotionally charged images, memories, and beliefs that cluster around a core wound and begin to function with a kind of autonomous life inside the psyche. A complex isn't something you have occasionally. It's something that has you, particularly in moments of intimacy, vulnerability, or emotional need. And here is what matters most for what we're about to explore. The complex formed around an emotionally cold parent doesn't stay in childhood. It travels. It becomes embedded in the way a person reads other people's silences, interprets neutral expressions, responds to affection and structures, often unconsciously, the emotional dynamics of every relationship that follows. Jung gave a specific name to the internal image a child forms of a parent, the parental imago. Not the actual parent, the psychic photograph, the interior representation. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth pausing here because it changes everything about how we understand these patterns. Your mother or father, as they actually were, complicated, limited, shaped by their own wounds, is one thing. The imago your psyche constructed of them is something else. It is a composite, built from thousands of small moments, the times they looked up from what they were doing and the times they didn't, the warmth that was present and the warmth that was missing, the way your needs were met or weren't, the words that were said, the words that never came. This inner image became your first template for intimacy, the model against which all future closeness would be measured, consciously or not. And if the imago was shaped by coldness, by emotional distance, by affection that was conditional or absent, then the adult psyche carries that template into every room it walks into. You didn't learn how to love in a vacuum. You learned it in a specific house, with specific people, under specific conditions, and part of you never left. The child who needed warmth and found cold air instead didn't simply feel sad and move on. She adapted. She developed strategies, ways of managing the emotional environment, of protecting herself from the pain of reaching out and finding nothing. Those strategies were intelligent, they were survival. The problem is that survival strategies have a stubborn tendency to outlast the conditions that made them necessary. And that is precisely where the 5 patterns we're about to explore come from. Before we continue, I want to pause for a moment. Everything we're exploring here, I know it can awaken something in you, a recognition that goes deeper than intellectual curiosity. a pull toward understanding something that has shaped you for a long time. I've been there too. And when I found that a video, no matter how precise, can only take you so far. At a certain point, you need more than information, you need structure, a way to move through this material in your own life, with your own history, at your own pace. If you're feeling that right now, there's something in the description that might be the right next step. Take a look when the video ends, and now, let's keep going. The first pattern is one that looks from the outside, like maturity. People who grew up with emotionally cold parents very often become extraordinarily self-sufficient. They handle their own problems. They don't ask for help easily, sometimes not at all. They are competent, reliable, the person others lean on. And for a long time, this can feel like strength. It is strength. That's not a misreading. But underneath the self-sufficiency, there is often a belief that was laid down very early, that needing something from another person is dangerous, that need will not be met, or worse, that expressing need will produce withdrawal, irritation, or absence. So the psyche learned to preemptively eliminate need, or rather, opononemi, to push it so far down that it became invisible, even to the person carrying it. The tell is not in how these individuals function when things are fine. It's in what happens when things aren't. In a moment of genuine distress, loss, illness, failure, they tend to become more isolated, not less. They close rather than open. They manage rather than reach. And they often feel a bewildering combination of wanting someone to notice and being unable to speak a single word that would make them noticeable. Where this comes from in the Imago is direct. The parent who did not respond to emotional need taught the child that emotional need is, at best, unwelcome. The pattern of self-sufficiency is not a character flaw. It's a calibration. What it's protecting is the child who once reached out and found nothing and decided at some deep level never to be that vulnerable again. The second pattern is closely related, and this next one is among the most misread in psychology because it looks exactly like independence. People who grew up with cold parents often develop what seems like an uncanny ability to read other people's emotional states. They are frequently described as perceptive, empathetic, intuitive, and they are. But the origin of this perceptiveness is worth examining because it didn't develop in a neutral field of healthy curiosity about others. It developed in a field of vigilance. When a child's emotional well-being depends on accurately reading a parent's mood, anticipating when to approach and when to withdraw, detecting the early signs of emotional unavailability before they fully arrive, the psyche sharpens its perceptual tools in very particular ways. Hyper-attunement to other people's internal states becomes a survival skill. And survival skills, as I said before, tend to stay active long after the threat has passed. So the adult who grew up in emotional coldness often brings an almost exhausting sensitivity to the emotional weather of everyone around them, while being strangely disconnected from their own. They know with remarkable precision when someone else is upset, withdrawn, or needs something. What they struggle to name often is what they themselves feel, or they notice it too late, or they notice it and immediately pivot to managing it rather than experiencing it. The imago at work here is elegant and painful in equal measure. I learned to prioritize your internal landscape because mine was never the relevant one. Imagine a house where the temperature never rises above 15 degrees, not because anyone chose this deliberately, simply because the heating system was broken, or because no one thought to fix it, or because the people who lived there had grown so accustomed to the cold that they stopped registering it as cold at all. It was just the house. A child raised in that house does not know that warmth of 22 degrees exists, or if they've glimpsed it elsewhere, at a friend's home, in a rare moment, it felt strange, foreign, almost suspect. Their internal thermostat calibrated itself across years of slow accumulation to 15 degrees. That is the normal. That is what feels like home. Now imagine that child grows up and someone loves them, genuinely, warmly, without conditions or withdrawal, without the ambient chill. And something inside them, not consciously, not maliciously, but with the absolute conviction of a deeply learned pattern, begins to look for the draft, begins to find the cold air that must be coming, because warmth this consistent has never existed in any environment that felt like safety. Sometimes they open the window themselves, not because they want to destroy what they have, but because the thermostat says this temperature is wrong. This is what the emotional patterns of people who had cold parents feel like from the inside, not moral failures, not self-sabotage in any simple sense, calibrations. The internal system responding as it was built to respond. to an environment that no longer exists, toward a temperature that was never safe. The third pattern lives in the interior. You won't always see it in behavior. You'll see it in what happens to a person when they are alone, after intimacy. People who grew up with emotionally cold parents frequently experience what I can only describe as a kind of love anxiety, a baseline anticipation that whatever warmth they've received is temporary, that the withdrawal is coming, that if they look closely enough at what just happened, if they replay it with enough attention, they'll find the evidence that it's already beginning to end. This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition trained on a very specific dataset. The dataset of a childhood in which warmth was either absent or unpredictable. When affection appeared occasionally, as it often did even in emotionally cold households, but then receded without warning or explanation, the child's psyche learned something specific. Closeness is followed by loss, not sometimes, reliably enough to build a model on. So the adult carries a kind of internal countdown, a waiting. And because the waiting is uncomfortable, the psyche sometimes does something ingenious and destructive at once. It finds ways to confirm the waiting's validity, to locate the proof, to detect the earliest signs of cooling in someone else's behavior, even when those signs aren't there. Because certainty, even the certainty of loss, is more tolerable than the unbearable suspension of not knowing. What this pattern is protecting is the child who learned that hope is dangerous, that expecting warmth and not receiving it hurts more than not hoping at all. The anxiety is not weakness. It is the psyche's attempt to never be caught unprepared again. Before we reach the final two patterns, which I want to spend real time on, because they cut deepest, I want to invite you to do something. If this video is giving language to something you've carried for a long time, that matters. Subscribe if you haven't, because this is the kind of work we do here, consistently and carefully, and there's a link in the description, the same one I mentioned earlier, for those who are ready to take this beyond what a video can hold. Now, patterns 4 and 5, these are the ones that most people don't discover in the abstract. They discover them in the middle of a relationship they were absolutely certain would be different. The fourth pattern is about what happens when intimacy actually arrives, when someone does not pull away, when the warmth is real and present and sustained. For most people, this would produce relief. For someone whose internal template was built in coldness, sustained intimacy can produce something closer to its opposite, a low, persistent discomfort, an urge to create distance, not because they don't want closeness, but because closeness, at a certain depth, begins to feel destabilizing, unsafe in a way they cannot articulate. Jung's concept of the complex is useful here. The complex formed around emotional coldness doesn't only activate in moments of rejection or loss, it activates in moments of too much warmth, because too much warmth is also foreign to the system. The thermostat registers it as abnormal. And what the psyche does with abnormal input, when it doesn't have another framework, is move toward familiar ground. Familiar ground in this case is distance, conflict that creates space, busyness that justifies unavailability, intimacy that goes to a certain depth and then, always in ways that seem rational, time stops. The person experiencing this often feels the contradiction acutely. They want closeness, they pursue it, and then, when it arrives, something in them pushes back. They can see themselves doing it. They don't entirely understand why, and they frequently carry a private shame about it, a sense that there is something broken in their ability to love or be loved. There is nothing broken. The system is working exactly as it was built. It just hasn't been updated to match the environment that now exists. Stay with me for this one. Because pattern 5 is the one most people discover not in therapy, but in the middle of a relationship they were sure would be different. The fifth pattern concerns what a person who grew up with emotionally cold parents comes to believe at the deepest available level about love itself, not what they think consciously. Most people with this history have done enough reading, enough reflection, enough conversation to arrive at the correct intellectual position. They know in theory that they deserve warmth, that love can be stable, that not every closeness ends in cold. What they believe at the level below theory is something else. At the level of the parental imago, at the level where the first template for intimacy was built, love and coldness are not opposites, they are cohabitants. Love arrived in the same package as distance. Warmth existed alongside withdrawal. The person who should have been the source of unconditional care was also the source of emotional unavailability. And so the psyche, building its model on that data, concluded something that no amount of intellectual correction has fully dislodged, that this is simply what love contains. that the cold is part of the deal, that to love someone is to accept that a portion of them will always be somewhere you cannot reach. This belief does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive in clear propositions. It shows up in the partners people choose, specifically in the pull toward those who offer just enough warmth to sustain hope and just enough distance to feel familiar. It shows up in the diminished expectations brought to relationships, the assumption, before the story has even started, that a certain ceiling exists. It shows up in the quiet resignation that coexists somehow with genuine desire. And it shows up, perhaps most poignantly, in the difficulty of fully accepting love from someone who offers it without condition. Because unconditional warmth, love that doesn't come packaged with coldness, doesn't match the template. It feels too simple, too exposed, too much like something that might be taken away. I want to say something carefully now, because how we end this matters as much as how we began. These 5 patterns, the compulsive self-sufficiency, the hyper-attunement to others at the cost of self-awareness, the anticipatory anxiety about loss, the reflex toward distance when intimacy deepens, and the belief that love and coldness necessarily travel together. None of them are character flaws. None of them are evidence that something fundamental in you is broken or unlovable or beyond repair. They are strategies. Sophisticated, intelligent, psychologically coherent strategies developed by a child who was trying to survive an emotionally demanding environment with the tools available to her at the time. The psyche that built these patterns was not defective. It was resourceful. It looked at the environment it had been given and it adapted. It found a way to continue. The only problem, is that the strategies didn't come with an expiration date. They didn't contain a mechanism for recognizing when the environment changed. They kept running after the original house was gone, after the parent became a memory, after entirely different people and entirely different kinds of warmth entered the picture. They kept running because no one told them they could stop. Jung believed, and this is not a paraphrase, but the direction of everything he wrote about individuation, that the goal of psychological development is not to eliminate the complexes, but to develop a conscious relationship with them, to know them, to be able to say, with some degree of clarity, that is the complex moving through me right now. That is the Imago speaking. That is the thermostat reaching for 15 degrees. And in that knowing, not always, not perfectly, but increasingly, to have a choice that wasn't available before. The child who grew up in coldness could not choose differently. She worked with what she had. The adult who can see the pattern and name it and trace it back to where it began, meaning that person has something the child didn't. Not a cure, not an erasure, but a map. And a map changes everything about how you move through a landscape. Which of these 5 patterns felt the most familiar to you? Not the easiest to admit, but the one that made you think I've been living with this for years and never knew what to call it? Write it in the comments. Sometimes naming it for the first time, even to strangers, is the first real step. If this video gave language to something that has been living in you without a name, please like it and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. This is the work we do here, one layer at a time. And the link in the description is there for whenever you're ready to go deeper than a video allows. There's no rush. It will wait for you. The question we began with, why is it so hard to receive love without waiting for it to disappear? It doesn't have a simple answer, but it has a real one. And the fact that you stayed to hear it tells me something important about where you are in this process. You're not just watching a video. You're beginning to look. That's not a small thing. In fact, for the part of you that learned to survive in the cold, it might be one of the bravest things you've done in a long time.